Hello, this is your queen coming to you live from Philadelphia. I love Philadelphia. And now for something completely different. Today we will be discussing matting and staining. I do so hope you will enjoy this lively English heritage, or is it French, art form, full of glorious rules and regulations for you to follow to the absolute letter of the laws of tradition. All right, that's enough of that. Keeping it girls. I am literally reading from a script today. Why? Because I have made 1,000 film clips and all of them seem to be missing some crucial bits of information, so I threw them out. First, I want to talk about rules. If you read about glass painting or you watch demos, you may come to the conclusion that there are a lot of rules. But in my classroom, craft rules are meant to be broken in the name of exploration, creativity, and art. Rules will teach you how to do something one way. Breaking them will teach you 1,000 ways. In terms of what gets internalized as the rules of craft, I want to say there really is no right or wrong, just consequences. So if you want to add a ton of gum arabic to your paint, it might not fire on in a way that you like. It might look ugly to you. It might not fuse to the glass well. It's your call, especially when you're learning. If you like the results and you can sleep at night, then go for it. Later, if you're selling the work with poorly fired paint, you may have a wee bit of an ethical consideration there. So consider that as well, but keep an open mind. The only rules are health and safety rules and no harming animals, children, and non-consenting adults. And be kind to each other, for goodness sakes. So here's the safety lowdown. These paints are toxic. They come with safety data sheets. You should read them and learn about proper protection and disposal. Don't worry, the paint isn't trying to kill you. Just take care, wear your dust mask and apron. You may want to wear gloves too. This is super dirty and messy, so clean up really good when you're done. The paint, while it doesn't contain lead, is pretty nasty stuff. And while it remains in powder form, you might accidentally breathe it in. So wear your dust mask. So here are some things you can try with matting. I already showed you this. This is a regular old mat with nothing done to it. A regular mat, once it's dry, can be used like a scratch board to make images before you fire them on. Another thing you can do is after the paint is fired on, you can treat it like it's black on clear flash glass. In other words, you can sandblast into it and you can engrave it and file it. Just make sure that it's fired on first. And also, it's a little easier than working with flash glass because the layer will be probably a lot thinner. Here I am using an engraving tool to make fine details in the eye. I like to engrave more than paint, so I do this a lot. Obviously, you can paint the details, but remember, once they're fired on, you can engrave them too. This is a shaded mat. These are done by badgering some parts more than others to make a shade. This is useful in traditional painting. And this is the texture you get if you badger for a really long time. It's definitely worth it to experiment with badgering a lot versus badgering a little, because they will get you different results. You can also make stipple mats by pouncing your badger up and down like this, boing, 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 or using a stipple brush, pouncing up and down with that, boing, boing, boing. This is the stipple brush. Actually, I don't know if it's a stipple brush, but I stipple with it. It's got very stiff hairs. Mixing the paint is very simple. I simply mix the powdered pigment with water to the consistency I prefer, and more on that in a second. Why water? Because where I am, water is still available and relatively non-toxic. True confession, I drink tap water. In the case of matting, I also add some gum arabic. When painting on sandblasted glass, as I am inclined to do, I do not add any gum. But for matting, which I will be doing on regular float glass with no sandblasting, just the raw material, the gum arabic is added to help the mat stick to the glass. It's not important for the firing or anything like that. It's just to help it stick to the glass. Otherwise, when you go to badger it, it would just badger all the way off. Bye-bye, Matt. Apropos of this, the paint will be fragile until it's fired on. So be careful not to touch it or accidentally wipe off parts of it. As for how much gum arabic, that is up to you. But I have heard it described as enough to look like a light snowfall on your pile of paint. Too much gum arabic and it will be hard to badger off. Plus, your paint might crizzle in the firing. Crizzle is a word meant to imply a sort of crackly look. So maybe try the light snowfall amount and then adjust the amount of gum up or down according to your experiences. You will find out soon enough how much gum arabic you want to use for your personal work. So here's another thing about glass paint. There's no such thing as painting thick. I have never seen an impasto made of glass paint. Why is that? Because the paint needs to fuse to the surface of the glass when it's in the kiln. And too thick, the outside layer would be basically trying to fuse to itself. It wouldn't be near the surface of the glass. So typically, glass matting is on the thin side. To get darker, richer tones or blacks, another layer must be painted and fired, sometimes multiple layers and multiple firings. There are ways to paint on glass without multiple firings in the kiln, but for now, suffice it to say that if you are thinning your paint with water, and you try to paint another layer on top of your previous water mat, you will simply wash away the previous mat and make a mess. So you must fire in between. The mats that are when they have an incompatible medium. So if you started with a turpentine trace line and then covered it with a water mat, you can do 2 layers of paint without firing in between. But I'm not showing you that. When mixing the paint for matting, a thinner, watery, soupy mixture will go on easy and look gray. It will also take a little longer to dry. I recommend that when you first begin because sometimes the really darker mats are really hard to badger. So, and as I said before, really thick paint won't even fire at all. All right, disclaimer. I am not someone who cares too much about making perfectly even badgered mats. That is not a skill in my wheelhouse. There are other glass painters who really do specialize in this, and I urge you to seek them out for instruction if that is something that you would like to do. But I stink at it, so there's that. First thing I want you to know is you can reclaim the paint on your palette. Just add whatever medium you were using before and mix it up and good as new, or kind of almost as good as new. You might want to cover it up. I cover mine up with this little metal cap to keep dust and cat hair from getting all over it. So here's how to mix the paint. It's so easy. You put some paint down and you add a little bit of gum arabic, or you don't add gum arabic. That is entirely up to you. It depends on what you're doing. If you are working on regular surfaces of glass that are not sandblasted, you should add a little. And you add enough to just make it look like a light snow has fallen. I'm sure you can't see that, but you maybe have seen a light snow. If you add too much, it'll crackle and frizzle in the kiln. If you don't add enough, it won't stick to the glass very well, and when you're brushing out the mat, it'll just all disappear. This is water, and this is a palette knife. Mix it up real good.
Apply the paint with a brush of your choosing. Just don't choose your badger. It needs to be kept for a separate purpose. Now, notice the paint isn't sticking. The paint is slightly abrasive and it will eventually stick. So I'm just going to cover the whole piece of glass evenly, well, kind of evenly, with some paint. And then I'm going to take the Badger blender and holding it vertical, straight up and down, make sweeping motions north, south, and east, west, very gently pulling the paint across the surface of the glass. So that's your basic mat. So now what do you do with it?
For me, matting is a way of experimenting with some of the wacky things that glass paint can do. It can be really improvisational and spontaneous. It's a process of discovery. It's really fun to see. Every mat will come out different. That said, if repeating your results are important to you, you will have to keep track of the mixtures and the processes you are using, or else you will forget everything like I have.
I'm going to turn the light table off so I can see when I spray the surface with something. In this case, maybe window cleaner. Then I'm going to dry it with a hair dryer and turn the light table back on. And using the same motions as before, I'm going to sweep the Badger blender over the surface to reveal this bubbly pattern. If there's a lot of gum arabic, it might be a little stubborn, so I might want to use my fingers a little bit if I get impatient. There you go, Bubblicious.
You can get interesting effects from putting down a bunch of paint and smushing something flat on it and pulling it up again.
Here I'm just going to use another piece of clear glass to squish it down and then pull it up again. And there you go. Interesting vegetal vein patterns. The next two images were made by putting the mat down, keeping it wet, and spraying it while it was wet, and then just letting it dry as is. And this is an old linoleum cut of a mouse, and I am going to press it into the mat and make a sort of veiny looking mouse ghost thing. And then I'm going to further play along with the process by painting into it, and when it's dry, scraping into it with a stick. It's all very unplanned and spontaneous. So there's the ghost mouse. Blow drying the mouse. Going into it with a stylus to scratch out some details. Badgering the mat yet again. And then what you're not seeing is that I am going to paint some shadows into it. And you can do that too. This mat is wet. I didn't dry it. I sprayed it, and now I'm going to dry it, pushing that paint all over the place with the hair dryer. What a mess. Then I badger it.
This image here, taken this past week, is literally the first time I ever bothered to write down my procedure. Most of the cool mats I've made in the past, I have no clue how I even made them now.
In this mat, I'm going to paint lines on with a paintbrush, dry them off, and then badger it and see what happens. And this is what happened. And in this one, I'm not even going to badger the mat. I'm just going to badger the brush strokes after they're dried. I think this is really amazing. Now here's a seriously fast-forwarded few minutes of me doing all kinds of things to glass that probably shouldn't be done, but I just can't help myself. I think this is so much fun.
Here's the basic procedure. Paint your mat on, let it dry. When it's dry, spritz it with something in a squirt bottle, or drip some liquid onto it, or paint some brushstrokes on it. I'm sure you can come up with more ideas. Then you are faced with a choice. Do you let that second application of wet stuff dry, or do you start badgering while it's still wet? Who am I to say? Both ways will give you different results. Have fun.
Here's a handy graphic with several of the variables that you can play with in different combinations to get different results.
There are a million choices. So glass paint, what is it? What is it not? There is a lot of terminology here, but the bottom line is that what professional glass artists call vitreous paints, seen here in this image, and enamels, which are every other color, are essentially the same thing except for one important thing. Vitreous paints, seen in this image here, are opaque and enamels are transparent. Opaque, translucent, and transparent. Now that is something really worth thinking about as a stained glass artist, not just for your paint, but for the glass you're working on also. The reason some paints are opaque is so that they will block the light transmission. That's what opacity does, is it blocks the light. It's easier to see definition in a stained glass image if it's not just blaring, eye-splitting colored light going into your eyeballs full blast all the time. Hence, the paint is used for definition and to modulate the light. Similarly, with the enamel colors, they are intended not to modulate the light so much as to modulate, hello, the color. So they are transparent. I don't know why anyone would use opaque colors on glass, as they will appear dark or black in a transmitted light situation. And for the record, when I have enameled, I really like Fusemaster enamels. But enameling is not the Judas Schechter method. When I want color, I make flash glass do it. So I am not going to be demonstrating now or ever the use of colored enamels. Let's talk about these glass stainers, colors, vitreous paints, whatever you want to call them, seen in the picture. Notice the exciting range of colors. Vitreous paints come in every color of blah. I personally only use stencil black, seen above in the top right. Vitreous enamels and paints are comprised of various oxides mixed with frit. Frit is a fine glass powder, and that's what enables the paint to fuse with the glass when it's fired in a kiln at a high temperature. You can apply the paint with brushes, pens, your fingers, just about anything, except don't use your tongue. And then there's silver stain. This is when stained glass artists start getting all swoony and weird. Silver stain is the origin of the term stained glass. And some say a panel should not be called stained glass unless it actually contains stain. Stain is silver nitrate mixed into a clay gamboge, also powdered. It is usually mixed with water. Then you paint it on the glass and stick it in the kiln. When it comes out of the kiln, it looks exactly the same as though nothing has happened and that it didn't fire on. But you need to wash the gamboge off, and it will reveal the yellow that has actually stained the glass, hence the term. It's not like paint that fuses. Silver stain actually stains the glass. Silver stain is a lot of fun because it's really uncontrollable. However, if uncontrollability is not your thing, you can check out Ken Leap's book, which tracks the results of many, many different types of silver stain on many types of glass at many different temperatures. It's quite the resource. Here's some silver stain examples of mine. Note the top one here, which is basically a badgered mat. One thing you need to know is that if you're working on clear float glass, silver stain will fire differently on each side. When float glass is manufactured, the molten glass is literally floated on a bed of molten tin. Once you get this glass in your hot little hands, The tin side will resist the silver stain. The one I just pointed out to you is probably painted on the non-tin side, whereas something like this is what the tin side would look like. And this piece here is a different stain altogether, which you are unlikely to encounter because it costs something like $9 million for an ounce. I tried some once when I was at Pilchuck Glass School. I don't own any myself. Now, if you want to figure out which is the tin side, you will need to buy this doodad. And I was unable to find inexpensive ones except on eBay. So maybe look on eBay. So what kind of brushes do you use for matting? Well, I've already discussed them a little bit. These are my personal brushes here. This is the Badger blender. And this is what I use to as an applicator brush. It is some kind of watercolor brush with natural hairs of some sort. And on the right is some kind of a stippling brush, which I have right here with me. The Badger brush is made from real badger hair. If you're a vegan, they now make synthetic badger. I don't know how well those brushes work, but they are available. You can get them from Blick. And of course, the nice blender is the $86 one. Doesn't that figure? And you can get a real badger brush from Amazon, or if you prefer, you can do research and find other companies that sell them. I found a somewhat inexpensive Langnickel brush at this particular website. I used to have one of these. They work okay. Wash your brush. First of all, only wash the tips of your badger blender. Only the tips. Down by the base is an animal skin glue. You don't want it to melt. All right, you get it nice and wet, right? And then you do this. Slappy, slappy, slappy. Whee! Just like that. And it's clean and dry. You can source your vitreous paints from the Rouchet Company. They are now a division of something called Schilling. They're at www.schillinginc.com. They sell these cool little kits at Schilling. Now that this kit does not have stencil black for some reason, but looks like a cool little kit. You can also try Sunshine Glass to get this paint. Other things you will need are water and an array of fun things to spray on your glass. This here is distilled vinegar, available at your local supermarket. If you want to know more about glass painting, these two books are very helpful. The one on the left is very hard to find. I would look on eBay. Every now and then they reissue it. It is the absolute Bible of glass painting, and it will tell you what you need to know. And the other books are also excellent. Vitreous paints and Fusemaster enamels fire on at about 1250 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 676 Celsius, a mere fraction above 666, I'm sorry to report. Silver stain fires lower at about 1050 degrees Fahrenheit or about 565 Celsius. If you are interested in getting your own kiln, I personally use a top-loading fusing kiln just like this one from Denver Glass Machinery. I have had it for decades with absolutely no need to do anything. It is a real warhorse of a piece of machinery. As for the firing, here is a firing schedule. You can program your kiln to reach the firing temperature, that's 1250, as I just said, in 30 minutes. Soak for 10 minutes. Now, when the paint cools down, if it has failed to fire on, you will need to try again and use a longer soak. And the way you know your paint is fired on is that the paint should be shiny when it comes out. If it is not shiny, you can try scratching at it with your craft knife. And if it comes off, it definitely didn't fire on. And if it kind of comes off, you have tack fired it, in which case I think you should refire for a full fuse. So program the kiln to reach temp at 30 minutes, soak for 10 minutes, and then ramp down. You can set your kiln to return to room temperature in 3 hours. If it is insulated, it will not be able to do that, but that's fine. Stained glass is thin and it is more or less even. It can almost air anneal, so 3 hours is ample amount of time. If you see that your kiln is at about 500 degrees, you can crack it a little bit to hurry things up. Now, I know that this is not the schedule you were hoping for, that you wanted something clear and scientific and precise. But I personally do not even have a programmable kiln. And I just want to say 37 years and no breakage except once, just once, one single time. So, what I am saying is that first and foremost, you need to know your kiln. They all have different personalities. My kiln actually came to me in a dream once and told me that her name was Lois. Lois fires paint at 1213, not 1250. Anyway, know your kiln. You can go up and cool down fairly fast. Just maybe don't open the kiln door when it's between 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit and 500, just to be on the super safe side. Some people like to open the kiln when it's at temperature to see if the paint has become shiny, but you won't need to do that when you know what temperature your kiln fires at. If you are interested in learning more about traditional glass painting or really anything at all about stained glass, you can check out the Stained Glass Association of America or the American Glass Guild. They can put you in touch with someone who teaches traditional stained glass painting workshops. And yes, if they were to merge, they would become SCAG. Bon appetit. Or shall I say, bon appetit. Bon appetit. Bon appetit.